Maybe just to open, Bill, you know, as Rocio noted, probably like a lot of the people here in the audience, I've read a lot of your stuff for many years. You probably first came to fame in the United States as a journalist winning the Pulitzer in Russia, as Moscow bureau chief in Russia. Mm-hmm. If you think about it, you were there for before the fall of the Soviet Union and the early years of Yeltsin. It's Russia and a country trying to kind of have its own rebirth and its own starting again. Right after that, you were bureau chief in Johannesburg in South Africa. Again, a country kind of going through enormous change, but a hopeful time and a chance for rebirth and starting again. When you retired from the Times, you could have done anything under the sun, obviously. How is it that you decided to kind of take upon a different form of focus upon, you know, rebirth and restarting, an idea of looking at criminal justice, prison reform, and getting involved with the Marshall Project? And could you also tell us, you know, a little detail about what the Marshall Project is and focus on?
Sure, happy to do that. The credit for the Marshall Project really goes to a guy named Neil Barsky, who was a Wall Street Journal reporter, covered real estate. His favorite memento that he has framed on the wall is a passage from one of Donald Trump's books saying that Neil Barsky was the most obnoxious reporter he'd ever met. He likes to say that he learned at the Wall Street Journal you don't have to be all that smart to get rich, so he went and got rich, he did hedge funds, and then he decided to become a philanthropist. His parents were active in the civil rights movement, and so what he settled on was the idea of creating a newsroom that would be independent and focused on the criminal justice system. Our mission statement said that our aim was to create a sense of urgency about the criminal justice system, not to specify or prescribe what to fix, not to advocate for specific policies, but to provide a clear grounding of what is in the criminal justice system. We talk about the sort of ecosystem of news, and I like to say that places like the Marshall Project are the oxygen in the ecosystem. They're what everybody else needs to breathe. So when Neil approached me, I was, at that time, I retired as executive editor and was writing an op-ed column. And I was attracted to the idea, but embarrassed to admit I knew almost nothing about the criminal justice system, except for covering night cops for the Portland Oregonian when I was a cub reporter. I'd never really written much about criminal justice. But I had this op-ed column, so I took the advantage of that to write a couple of columns on the subject and get superficially acquainted with how the policing works, how the courts work, how prisons work. And that was the beginning of an education that is still continuing, very much continuing. I'm not an expert on the prison system. I like to say that experts are the opposite of journalists. Experts have answers, journalists have questions. And I still have a lot of questions. But the first thing I did after I retired from the Marshall Project, I spent 5 years running the Marshall Project, building it up. Not very often that when you're 65, somebody offers you an opportunity to build a newspaper from scratch. But I learned a lot from the other reporters and editors there, and I hope I've given them due credit in the book, because a lot of the reporting in it was theirs. Did that for 5 years. It's still thriving and growing. And I wanted to keep a hand in criminal justice, so my first idea was to teach a class at Sing Sing Prison up the Hudson River from New York. And I did that for exactly 4 weeks until the pandemic shut the prison down completely to outsiders. And at that point, I felt I needed a project, so I approached a guy named Nick Lemon, who runs Columbia Global Reports. He puts out about 6 times a year these short, Nick refers to them as nonfiction novellas. You can read them in a long afternoon on single subjects, and I pitched him the idea of doing one on prisons. I wanted to do prisons because it's the most mysterious aspect of the criminal justice system by design. I mean, the walls are not just there to keep people in, they're there to keep prying eyes out. Courts and police have their problems, prosecutors have their problems, but the courts and the police operate to a large extent in the public eye. Prisons are, your impressions of prisons, if you think about them at all, are formed by probably sensational TV shows, maybe reading some prison literature, but most people, a lot of people prefer not to know what goes on in prisons, I think. So that was the genesis of the book, and along with the 5 years worth of work from my colleagues at the Marshall Project, I spent about a year and a half interviewing criminologists, incarcerated people, formerly incarcerated people, corrections officials, just kind of across the board, trying to figure out what is prison for.
And I think the book is an incredible array of information and a kind of enlightening chapter after chapter. I think, like I mentioned before, the council we're fortunate to host some incredible speakers, like yourself, with great books. But I've learned more from this book than I'd say many of our other incredible speakers at great events, because I think it's something that so many Americans don't know about, or maybe we don't choose to know about. Just maybe you could just give a few really basic facts to kind of set the stage. We call it mass incarceration for a reason, because it is a mass. It is massive. It's gone down a bit in the last few years, but almost 2 million people in the United States.
Right.
Over 4 million people are on some form of parole or probation. Almost 6 million people in the system in the country. How does that compare to any other what we would consider a first world country, whether it be Japan or Germany or comparable countries?
We're an outlier in the world. People use the number that America has 5% of the world's population and 25% of its incarcerated people. Wow. And that's you can massage the numbers either way, but that's essentially true. We incarcerate 5 times as many people as the United Kingdom does. I think 7 times as many as Germany, or maybe it's 9 Germany. I can't keep all the numbers straight in my head. The ones that are closest to us in incarceration but still trailing behind are places like Rwanda, Turkmenistan, not exactly ideal role models for a democracy. But the other way of thinking about the mass and mass incarceration is to compare it with our own history. In most of the 20th century, there was a fairly steady rate of incarceration. So roughly 100 people out of every 100,000 population were incarcerated. Starting in about 1970, for a number of reasons, that number began to shoot up, and it eventually reached 5 times that number. We'll talk a little bit about the factors that led to that extraordinary increase. But so even by our own standards of a couple hundred years ago, we massively over-incarcerate.
And also, just you mentioned in the book, you're not approaching this solely in a theoretical manner or as a journalist, but from a personal perspective. Briefly, I'm sure it's a hard thing to discuss, but can you talk about why it is that you yourself and your family understands the calls for the needs for justice and revenge?
Yeah, I think probably most people in this room have people close to them who've been affected by crime. My wife's mother was murdered in New York City in 1983. I have close friends who've been raped, and I understand the visceral yearning to get even, to punish. And punishment is not inherently evil. Punishment is how you remind people that the laws matter. There are guardrails that are set up for society to function. And if you don't have punishment, then there's nobody's going to obey the rules. But punishment shouldn't be dictated by the emotions of the victims or by anger. There should be a proportionality to the response to crime.
and the book covers, the history of the issues and kind of the, the principles of theoretically why we have to have a prison system, but what it's supposed to accomplish. But you discuss kind of the four, pillars of deterrence and incapacitation. But can you talk about why it is you and say the Marshall Project in particular, and most people really studying reform for our criminal justice system and our prison system, are really saying the most work and the most dire area to work in is in terms of rehabilitation. You mentioned in the book 95% of people who go to prison are going to get back out. So
Right.
Can you talk about why that is really the most important issue to focus on?
Yeah. The book deals, I hope, selectively in numbers. I mean, I didn't want to write a textbook. But the one number that always kind of hovers in the back of my mind when I'm thinking of criminal justice is the number 600,000. More than 600,000 inmates at federal and state prisons are released every year. That's 1,600 a day. And so the choice that we face as a society is, what do you want those people to be like when they get out? Because they are going to get out. Do you want them to be brutalized, alienated, lacking in any plausible marketable job skills, detached from their families and their communities? Or do we want to think about them as people who are going to be your next door neighbors and citizens who elect well, actually most of them don't get to vote for a while, but good law-abiding citizens. And that to me is a choice that's not hard to make. But in practice, we do a lot of the former. The recidivism rate, there are lots of different ways of measuring recidivism, but more than half by some measures, more than half of the people who are released from prison are rearrested within 3 years.
Which is staggering. And, we're here in Texas. I love Texas, a great place. It's been my home since I was a child. We have a lot to be proud of, but also as a state and really as a country, we should not, and the Holocaust Museum is a great example of it. We need to be honest about facing our history, whether it's in the United States or other parts of the world. Can you talk about the legacy and the enormously disproportionate number of African Americans and Latinos who are imprisoned in the United States, and really, in some ways, the most kind of inhumane and kind of truly wicked legacy goes back to the Civil War. It goes back to the 13th Amendment. Yes, we ended slavery, but a huge exception was created. And can you talk about what that led to in terms of the reality of what some people call slavery by another name?
Sure. And I apologize for too many numbers, but some of them are so mind-boggling that you have to recite them. Roughly 1 in 100, every 100 white men over the age of 18 are in prison. Roughly the number for Hispanics is 1 in 36. The number for blacks is 1 in 15. That's 1 in every 15 black men over the age of 18 in this country is in prison or jail. There's a chapter in my book entitled, "What's Race Got to Do with It?" And I joke that the answer is everything, which is not entirely true, but it's pretty close. You alluded to the abolition of slavery. The 19th Amendment had a loophole in it. The 19th Amendment said that nobody should be forced to engage in forced labor, with one exception, and that's for people who've been convicted of a serious crime. So the slave plantations of the South essentially turned into prison convict labor plantations, to paint the picture fairly simply. Michelle Alexander, I'm sure some people here have read her amazing book, The New Jim Crow. It's about 10 years old now, but it stands up. And her premise is that institutional racism is the explanation for the for most of mass incarceration. And she makes a strong case. There are debates on the details and how you measure the change over time, and to what extent it was a design as opposed to just bad human behavior. But the new Jim Crow is I think, basically gets it right.
And, you know, I suppose we opened about it, people say out of sight, out of mind. Do you and other kind of especially other criminologists and experts you've worked with?
Not an expert.
Okay, not an expert. Okay, well, but you know a lot of experts.
I do.
I mean, a lot of them I think would agree that historically for decades there's been a racial component to that as well. That maybe, especially maybe for a white majority population, there was not as much empathy and consideration what's happening, especially to African Americans and then later other minorities. Can you talk about how maybe that became a factor in much, much more recent history, and then the 1980s, 1990s, about some of these massive and kind of draconian federal crime bills that were passed with bipartisan support, Republicans and Democrats, Clinton and Biden, on board as much as their Republican counterparts?
Yeah, you've said it. We're really going back to the roots of mass incarceration and how it became mass incarceration. In the 70s, a number of things were happening. Crime was up, it spiked. The other thing that was happening was the Black empowerment movement, the civil rights movement, and the more radical wing of the civil rights movement. And people were scared by the crime rates. The news media was complicit in sensationalizing what was going on. And there were plenty of politicians happy to use fear-mongering to get themselves elected. So you had the war on crime, the war on drugs, and they were racially tinted. You mentioned early on the question, touched on the question of whether I'm an optimist about the system. And I shy away from that word because I think of the prison system as like a big catch-all tank, a sewer, if you will, for all the problems of the society writ large. So the racial inequality, the substandard education system, unemployment, inadequate mental health care, all these problems in the society at large flow into the prison system. And so you can't really transform the prison system without making some effort to transform the society that feeds into it. Well, that's...
And I suppose just another kind of pretty stark and harrowing example you discuss in the book. Can you talk a bit about how the opioid crisis, kind of the cruel, juxtaposition of in the 1980s and 90s, crack, which disproportionately affected African American communities, was a national crime issue, whereas the opioid crisis, which disproportionately affects the white community, especially oftentimes white rural areas, is seen as a public health issue. Can you talk about that, and maybe if there is something good to come out of it, that the fact that maybe it's impacting a larger white population is opening more people's eyes to the realities of our failures of criminal justice and our prison system?
Yeah, well, you kind of answered your question.
Sure, okay, yeah.
I mean, the opioid crisis started out as a problem of over-prescribing medicine, and it was started among ordinary, working class, middle class people, or people with health coverage, and a lot of them, 70% of the people who die in a typical year from drug overdoses are white, which is definitely not the story. One of the more egregious excesses of the war on crime was to identify crack cocaine, which is sold in smaller doses in poorer communities, to make the punishment for dealing with crack cocaine 100 times what it was for powder cocaine, which is more used by white users.
And then just in terms of maybe change and calls for reform, I think what's really interesting in the book, if you could discuss, in reality, it's going to require support from both the left, from the right, from people in the middle. People might say, oh, I'm not surprised if there were some progressive left-wing people behind it or whatever, but can you talk about how it became an issue for Republicans and conservatives? And maybe in particular, could you give an example or two of how it became a prominent issue and really an issue pushed through by many Republican lawmakers?
Sure. There is a movement that started about, I'm guessing, 15 years ago. People don't remember this very well, but in the 2016 presidential election, there were 4 of the leading candidates, including Ted Cruz, for the presidential nomination, that were embraced by a group called Right on Crime, which is the conservative movement for criminal justice reform, based in Austin. Right on Crime brought together libertarians who came to think of the criminal justice system as just another example of big, excessive, overpowering government meddling in your lives. Budget cutters who wanted to cut the prison budgets, use the money for tax giveaways. Some evangelicals who, some of whom had done time behind bars and were horrified at the lack of freedom and the lack of care and the abuses of the inmates. And I actually wrote a piece for the New Yorker in about 2005, I think, in which I quoted some criminologists saying this could be the Nixon goes to China movement, because there is a conservative case to be made for criminal justice reform. That's been pretty muted lately. As we saw during the midterm elections, there was a lot more shouting about crime, and crime has been a problem. I mean, but if you choose that as your #1 issue, you're probably
not going to be reforming.
You're probably not going to be reforming.
Right. And just to turn to, maybe where we can learn from, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, some of the examples in the United States, models that have been attempted, smaller scale, completely unique, different prison programs. But can you talk about why it is a lot of criminologists, people, working and trying to make a difference in the prisons, looked especially, say, at the German models, the Scandinavian, in particular, you note the Norwegian models, and kind of just briefly, what are a few of the ways that, say, German prisons, Norwegian prisons are so dramatically different to our own?
Sure. I mean, obviously, we're not Norway, which is a small, relatively homogeneous, oil-rich welfare state. But organizations like the Vera Institute for Justice and the Brennan Center have organized field trips for American corrections officials, senior corrections officials in the States, and in some cases just rank and file prison guards, to go over and watch how they do it in their prisons. Their prisons are premised on the idea that you want to keep a sense of normalcy in people's lives while they're incarcerated, so that when they get out, they're not completely flummoxed by how the world works, and they haven't lost their sense of responsibility. So, for one thing, the prisons tend to be a little more like college campuses and a little less like stacks of cages. Probably the most dramatic difference is the role and the preparation of staff. In a typical American prison, if you want to be a corrections officer, which is the term they prefer over guards. If you want to be a corrections officer, you're going to get a few weeks of training, mostly in crowd control and self-defense. In Germany, if you're going to be a corrections officer, it's a prestige job that pays really well. You're going to do 2 years of college-level training that includes things like criminal justice law, human rights law, psychology. And your role when you go to work is to engage with the prisoners, to try to figure out what it was that led them into their life of crime, whether it's mental illness, addiction, joblessness, homelessness, whatever, and then try to address that while you have them, while you have their full attention. One of the problems, and not, you want me to talk about the places that have tried to emulate?
Yeah.
I mean, I've talked to officials in 4 states, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Oregon, and believe it or not, North Dakota, where the top corrections officials of the state had been on these field trips to visit Norway or Germany or Sweden, and had come back not hoping to replicate those prisons in an American context, but to learn some lessons from them. And in several places, they created little islands. There's one in Chester, Pennsylvania, that actually calls itself Little Scandinavia, where they took one unit of the prison, retrofitted it so that it's more, not quite like a college dormitory, but more like it has more common spaces. The cells are a little cleaner and more appealing. And the prisoners have responsibility for living their lives. They get themselves up in the morning, they fix their breakfast, they have either jobs or schools to go to. And one of the geniuses of the system is that they hired, I think, 8 lifers who have been in the system for 20 or 30 years and made them the mentors to the inmates who are in this program. It's too early to tell how successful this is because you need time to assess. You need people to get out and either succeed or fail, and not that many people have gotten out yet.
Okay.
But I spent a day at Chester. They were also shut down by the pandemic, which interrupted their launch of their program, but I interviewed a lot of the lifers, and I came away feeling fairly optimistic about that program.
And you touched upon it a bit earlier. You mentioned Germany. It's 2 years of intense training and studying, comparable almost to getting a college degree or an associate's degree. Yeah. But maybe in the book, I think we should touch upon what's maybe even more important is it's a mentality shift. It's a perspective. In North Dakota, you mentioned that it was who they're going to hire that was different. It was the German or Norwegian model is of thinking themselves almost as therapists, as social workers, trying to help them change as opposed to just being a jailer. Can you also talk about the idea of just absolutely people still need to serve time. They need to, if they committed a crime, especially when they need to pay their debt to society. But the idea of these new programs treating these individuals with dignity, treating them, in essence, maybe what they haven't had in many years as another human being.
Yeah. I mean, the prisons in Germany and Norway and those other countries have thousands of prisoners in them. They're not averse to punishment. They recognize the need some people need to be removed from society. Prisons are not filled with innocent people. Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
But just that, like you mentioned, the idea of restoring a sense of dignity. The idea that not necessarily they would see each other as peers, but it does not have to be, basically a completely us versus them mentality.
Yeah, it starts with the assumption that your punishment is that you're taken away from, you can't go home. The punishment is a deprivation of liberty. But in most of the more enlightened European prisons, people retain all of their other rights, including the right to vote, importantly, and they do vote, but also the right to safety, the right to education, the right to have contacts with your family. And the German Constitution actually defines dignity as a human right under the state constitution. When you interview incarcerated people or formerly incarcerated people and ask them, what would you, I did this with a little sort of random focus group of current and former inmates, and they say, yes, the programming is, it's really important to have programs, college education programs, job training, and alcohol and drug management and so on, but the most important thing is to treat people with respect. A little bit of dignity goes a long way to lowering the level of violence and menace inside prisons.
And we touched upon it, a bit earlier, but the dearth of knowledge and information we have about men in prison, it's probably that much more so for women. It's a relatively speaking a smaller percentage, but especially, I think with the opioid crisis, the number of women, the rate in which women are going to prison in some places is double what it is in recent years now compared to men. Right. Texas, despite all the people from California moving here recently, we are still just the second largest state in the country. California has 10 million more people than Texas, but we have by far the largest women's incarcerated population in all of the United States. Can you talk about kind of the realities of women's prisons and maybe how they are in many ways different to men's prisons? In the book, you talk about the idea of the importance of kind of recreating a family structure and kind of why and how women's prisons are different.
Right. Well, prisons are basically designed for men. And there's a logic to that. 90% of the incarcerated people are men. But the women get short shrift on job-related programming. They tend to be typecast as, you can have a course in cosmetology, but you're not going to learn how to drive a forklift. Mm-hmm. But the major difference, whenever I interviewed women who were in prison or had been in prison, I always asked them, do you watch Orange is the New Black? Which is probably most people's concept of what life in a women's prison is like. And mostly they could identify a lot of things that they thought were ridiculous and that they're over-sensationalized, and it's TV. But the one thing that show got right, several women told me, is how women organize in prison. In men's prison, it's basically gangs, and mostly gangs that are identified by race. And then there's a hierarchy, and everybody, including the people supposedly running the prison, tends to respect the voices of the gang leaders. In women's prisons, I'm told they set out to recreate a family. So the women study together, they share feelings together, including sometimes romantic feelings. And that is the most useful survival skill, they say, in getting through prison. It also makes them vulnerable. Because if you're running a prison and the women are doing something you don't like, or seem tempted to protest something about the conditions in the prison, all you have to do is take one or two and transfer them to another prison, and you break up the family.
Mm-hmm. And maybe just in a follow-up to that, I think one of the most haunting issues you discussed in the book. Again, not to absolve people, or say, no, the babies, not to absolve people of the crimes they committed. Many of them came from incredibly difficult, hard upbringings and childhoods. But can you talk about how women in particular are much more likely to experience incredible trauma long before they ever became even a teenager or a young woman?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. it's more than double the rate of men. Women inmates have experienced usually sexual violence in their younger days. And prisons don't quite know how to deal with that. I mean, there are laws aimed at reducing rape and sexual assault, either by inmates on other inmates or by guards on inmates. But they haven't succeeded in stopping it.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask two more questions. I want to open up to you guys. Again, if you prefer to write a card, some people, you don't want to stand up in front of a bunch of strangers and say something, feel free to do a question that way, or I will have the microphone in a second. But I want to, again, try and be optimistic. You said that's maybe not the best word, but at least point out success stories, point out where things have gone well. We are in Texas. I'm not trying to be critical before of Texas. An area where we can be proud is some of the programs that are happening here. Huntsville, many of you, about an hour and a half straight north from here. Can you talk about what's called the PEP project?
Sure.
And why and how it's different?
It's the Prison Entrepreneurship Program. I don't know of anything else quite like it, at least on the same scale in other states. The idea is that the people running the program pick inmates who convince them they genuinely want to change themselves, change their lives. They transfer them to a special unit, and teachers, mostly volunteers from the business community, come in and teach them the basic skills of running a business, things like resume writing and payroll. And they also challenge them to come up with an idea for a business that could make money. And they make grant money available to a certain number of the most promising ideas, so that when inmates get out, they can take the grant and actually try to bring their vision to life. There are a couple of knocks on the program. One is that it is infused with a lot of Christianity. The inmates who go into it are not vetted for religious beliefs, and they're not explicitly teaching religion, but there's a lot of kind of Christian values. Mm-hmm. And the other rap on the program is that they're cherry picking the people who are most likely to succeed, because the main criterion for getting into the program is to convince your interviewer that you really, really are fed up with your old life and you want to change. So it's lower hanging fruit, but my own feeling is that successes are so scarce in prison mm-hmm. that you should celebrate them wherever you can.
And lastly, for a lot of you who are Holocaust Museum members and know the great work all of the museums do across the country, and there's similar counterparts in Europe and elsewhere. Last year I was here when they had your Nelson Mandela exhibit. You're someone who spent a lot of time with Nelson Mandela. Your many years as bureau chief in Johannesburg. You told me you got to travel with him during his first presidential campaign and spent a lot of time with him. To a lot of people, myself included, he's a hero. He's not a saint. There are, especially his early years, he was understandably perhaps, willing to consider violence or supporting violent means of overthrowing a brutal government. But when he did come to power, when de Klerk and a brutal white minority was finally put out of power, I think what most people say is most incredible about him was, if you could talk about it from your personal experiences with them, this idea of forgiveness and not seeking retribution, and basically, you got your foot off my neck and I'm going to put it now on your neck. Can you talk about maybe what we as Americans could kind of learn from Mandela, and maybe an idea more broadly of second chances and redemption and forgiveness, say for our criminal population?
Yeah, well, forgiveness was not an easy sell in South Africa either. Mm-hmm. There was certainly plenty of acrimony, and a lot of it came out in violence forms. The last time I talked to Mandela was about 15 years ago. I was then executive editor of the Times, and I was invited to come speak at a conference on media in Johannesburg. And so I took my then 10-year-old daughter along with me to show her some of South Africa, because she wasn't born yet when I was a correspondent there. And I took her in to meet Mandela, which,
pretty
to her
incredible
credit,
for a kid,
she found impressive. And the reason my pretext for getting in to see him was I'd been assigned to write his advance obituary, and I wanted to talk to him. I told him that was my purpose, and I wanted to talk to you, ask you questions, and the answers won't be published until after you're dead. But I asked him that question because it's what everybody asks about him. What did you do with those feelings of desire for vengeance? And he can stir up a lot of emotions, but he was essentially a cerebral character. And he just said it was so counterproductive. It was stupid. And it was not a path to solutions, it was a path to failure. It was a completely pragmatic rejection of the idea of vengefulness and endorsement of forgiveness. I wish more people got that.
And I suppose you think there are lessons we could learn from that as well, that there is a need to serve time, there also needs to be, the United States, we're famous for that. We pride ourselves and say we're the country of second chances. That's why a lot of immigrants come here in the first place. We're a country that says you can reinvent yourself, or you're a Hollywood star and you end up with a drug addiction or this failing. We celebrate when you remake your life, but we don't give that chance to people who are incarcerated.
Yeah, well, there's a 200-year history in this country of the tension between the desire to punish and the professed belief in redemption. This is a glib comment, but I sometimes think of it as sort of our Puritan tradition and our Quaker tradition. The Quakers were very big into prison reform more than 200 years ago.
But the Puritans ran out. Won out.
The Puritans seem to be winning most of the time.
A good question here. Someone asks, could you expand upon why you believe voting to be an important right for prisoners, and elaborate about why people may not see it that way?
Yeah. There's a phenomenon known as prison gerrymandering, which means you build a prison in a more rural community away from big cities, where it's easier to get people to provide the land, and where the local community sees dollar signs and jobs and attracting a big institution. And so what happens is the inmates, as we've already established, are likely to be people of color from the big cities, but they're counted in the census as being residents of this rural area. So the clout of the local community in Congress and allocation of the various funds is increased by the population of the people in prison who don't get to vote. And some of it's been done quite deliberately.
And I think one of the shocking bits of information in the book is, again, the racial component to it. I think you said some states 1/5 of the African-American voting population is disenfranchised and can't vote. And
there are two states where you can vote while you're incarcerated, Maine and what's the other one?
Vermont, maybe?
No.
Okay.
It'll come to me later.
Okay. And a lot of great questions from you all, and a lot of these are topics you discuss in the book as well. And again, I'm pushing the book, even if Bill won't. You'll learn a lot if you want to get it afterwards. Someone asked, can you discuss the difference between corporate prisons and prisons run entirely by the state?
Yeah, there's only about 10% of the prisoners incarcerated in this country are in prisons that are managed by for-profit corporations. But that understates the influence of the profit motive in the correction system. because even most state-run prisons contract out all kinds of services, their health care, their cafeteria, their telecommunications, their transport, uniforms even. So there's a lot of money in prisons. The best thing I've seen on the different culture in the for-profit prisons is a book that Shane Bauer wrote. He's a Mother Jones reporter who went undercover as a prison guard for 6 months or so in one of the big privately run prisons. And he basically talks about the influence of the bottom line demands. I mean, prisons, privately run prisons are run on the money is allocated on the same basis as it is at hotels. It's your occupancy rate. So you have no incentive to get people out of prison because they're occupying beds and you're getting paid.
And are you all right? Just you guys have a lot of good questions. I want to try and get to them off. We just go a few minutes longer. Is that okay with you, Bill? Is that all right?
I've got nowhere else to be.
Okay. Just a few questions, kind of related topics. Dennis asks, is it possible to even say, what is the percentage of practice and maybe focus upon punishment versus rehabilitation in the United States? And maybe in terms of maybe learning from other nations. Someone asks, if the United States adopted prison reform systems as in Norway, do you think we would have similar results?
Well, I think you have to sort of pick and choose what you want to emulate. And you have to do it incrementally. The only way that you can sell politically the idea of enlightened prisons is to do some demonstration projects, and then if you can demonstrate success, then you can expand them. There are a couple of problems with that, though. One of them is the people who tend to start up pilot projects are the enthusiasts who maybe went to Norway and saw how they did it there and they wanted to do something like it themselves. But those people move on, and there's a change of administration and the promising experiment fails. The other obstacle to trying to replicate what they do in Europe is money. It's expensive to do it well. Now you save the Norwegians and the Germans save some money by not incarcerating so many people or not incarcerating them for so long. But it's still, you need higher staffing ratios, you need more training of the prison staff. You need to rejigger the infrastructure so that it's not just big stacks of cages. It costs money.
And just kind of related to programs, Harry asks, maybe you're familiar with the specific program, what do you feel about the New York program of integrating social service programs early in the criminal justice system to avoid incarceration?
Prevention is definitely the way to go. And when people are incarcerated, one of the complaints that I heard from my sort of large focus group of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people is part of the problem is where they do have programs that are intended to make you a good citizen when you get out. They don't introduce them until you're in your final year of prison. They should. This is almost unanimous from anybody who spent time in prison that you need to start as soon as they get there, find out what went wrong and try to fix it.
A good question is something you discussed in the book here as well. Linda asks, for the prisoners who attain college degrees or other work skills, what happens when these qualified individuals are released? They're looking for employment, but they're eliminated from the job market due to criminal background checks.
Yeah, it's a problem. A lot of employers are not eager to hire people who have a criminal record. There's been some success in the so-called ban the box movement, which says that you don't put a box on the front of your application for a college admission or for a job you check the box if you've been convicted of a felony. It doesn't mean you can't ask a prospective employee if they have a criminal record, but it isn't the first thing you see. And the Common App for college admissions has eliminated the box. A number of employers have, but it's, I mean, one complaint or one criticism I've read about it, I don't know how true it is that denied the evidence of the box, they use other evidence, the color of the skin of the person who's applying for the job. So instead of being disqualified for being a felony, you're racially profiled.
An interesting question. I normally they wrote their full name and previous position, so I think it's okay to say it. John Shanahan, he says he's a former assistant commissioner at the New York City Department of Correction. Can you give your thoughts on New York's Rikers Island and its future? Subject covered extensively by the New York Times and recently by Jared Shanahan. He says no relation.
Yeah, where to begin with Rikers? I mean, in his 2 terms as mayor, probably the most radical thing that Bill de Blasio did was to win agreement to close Rikers Island down and replace it with 4 prisons, new prisons, more progressive prisons located in the boroughs so they'd be convenient to family and lawyers and courts. And they'd be built with ample room for educational programming. And along with creating these 4 additional borough prisons, they were going to cut the total jail population in New York City by half, or more than half. That proposal ran into predictable criticism from the Corrections Officers Union, from the neighbors of the places where the prisons were potentially going to go, and unexpectedly also from prison abolitionists who said, you can't build new prisons because we should abolish prisons altogether. So if you're in prison now, that means you're sort of stuck waiting for the revolution. More recently, the problem at Rikers is a hellhole, and I think the last I saw the numbers, it was approaching 20 people who died in that jail, mostly suicides and drug overdoses. There's a dispute now over what role, if any, the federal government should play in taking some authority over Rikers Island. Yes?
We talked about states, and you just mentioned the federal government. Can I ask about our federalist system and both dollars and the state-run prison system? I don't know the breakdown of federal prison population and state-run population, but each state can make their own rules and spend their own dollars as they generally see fit. Is that a feature in your eyes? Is that a bug? Are the feds more helpful or more harmful if they're doing it better or worse in your eyes?
I don't know quite how to answer that. I mean, the state management of the prisons, the state authority over the prisons creates the opportunity for a more progressive state to show a better way to do things. But it also allows the recalcitrant places that that are the worst of the worst to stay that way too. The Bureau of Prisons is, like most government agencies, responsive to the political trends of the time. So, and they are constantly insisting that they're underfunded, so they can't implement the reforms that are passed. I guess it's conceivable that the federal prison system could be, both by setting an example and by, well, actually, we should start with, they can model policies like doing away with mandatory minimum sentences, controls that they don't really control, but they can set an example. That's not a very thorough answer to your question.
Sure,
I'm
yeah.
afraid, but
And are you guys okay? Okay, I don't want to go too much longer for you, but yeah, maybe I'll just do these, just the written ones, and then I'll go out to the audience. Is that okay with you guys? Diane asked, and it kind of touched upon something you'd mentioned earlier. Is there any likelihood that the concept of tough on crime could come to embrace the value of criminal justice reform?
every reform group that I've encountered makes exactly that argument, that it's not just about being humanitarian, it's about public safety. Those people you're sending out, remember 1,600 every day, are just keeping the streets unsafe unless you give them a purpose.
And I think this is a really interesting question. Daria asked, you mentioned that you were not opposed to punishment itself. Does that stem from a belief in free will? And if so, how do you justify that?
It's getting a little personal.
Yeah.
I do believe in free will as a general,
Reality. Yeah, okay.
And I mean, I don't think I would be in journalism if I didn't believe in free will, because otherwise you're just...
If it's all predestined, what are we doing?
It's all predestined.
Yeah, okay.
You don't have a chance to change anything.
Yeah. Good question. I'll try and go in rep order. Okay, sorry, and then get you in the back. Yeah? What's your question?
The majority of prisons in Texas do not even have air conditioning. And with the climate crisis, that's only going to get worse. We're essentially roasting people in our prisons.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea, and that's true for many southern states and also throughout the United States, any idea how to approach a legislature in Texas, in states like Texas, the governor, as Attorney General, represented the Department of Corrections against overheating lawsuits? So any ideas on how to approach our legislation?
Yeah, I'll give you two answers, and they're both pretty obvious. One of them is lawsuits, because, I mean, there's a constitutional right to not face cruel and unusual punishment, and even conservative courts have often taken, like the state of California is under a mandate, has been for years, to reduce its overcrowded prisons, and they've cut their prison populations 25%. The Supreme Court made them do it. So lawsuits are one answer. The other is a self-serving answer on my part, but journalism. I mean, the Marshall Project has written quite a bit on the air conditioning problem, and in places where the problem is storms rather than heat, they have flooding problems too. So that's, I guess, the basic premise of my book is you've got to see these things. You've got to. They are not transparent institutions, so you need to redouble your resources to report on what's going on.
Back to, yeah, question?
Yes, so you mentioned that kind of this new system.
Okay, can you all pass that back to her? Thank you. Yeah.
You'd kind of mentioned that a lot of these European systems would work a lot better in the U.S. and kind of help, and maybe we haven't seen how this has played out in the U.S. yet, but could help a lot of these prisoners integrate back into society better. But as kind of how would you go about convincing the public that this is a good idea? I know you mentioned that like these small little tests would be beneficial and proving to the public that this would be beneficial to our society, but I mean, a lot of people don't believe in scientific experiments that happen. How could you ensure that, or how ways could you go about convincing the public that this is what society needs and this is how to fix the problem that we have?
I couldn't understand part of your question. Could you clarify it just a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm just asking kind of, since we've seen in the past that a lot of some scientific experiments are not well received by the public always. How can you ensure, or how would you go about convincing the public that this social experiment is worth putting our tax dollars into?
I'm going to repeat my answer to the previous question. I don't believe journalism is the answer to every problem, but it's one of the levers that we have that we can pull. People need to know what's going on in order to muster the will to fix it.
And maybe just last kind of two questions out there. Yeah, you got it. Yeah. And then
Bill,
Al.
thank you very much. I'm John Shanahan, and I'm the one who asked the question about Rikers Island. I have
What years were you in New York?
In the 90s. So I'm responsible, I'm afraid, for building most of the current infrastructure on Rikers Island.
Well, the problem is only a small percent due to the infrastructure.
Yeah. The question about the federal role, I think, is very important. I did not come to Rikers Island except for the fact I was recruited by the city of New York because of a federal judge and a federal court order on conditions of confinement. And the feds essentially had to say to the city, by the end of the 80s, we've had enough. The conditions there are so bad that we want you to fix the problem and put the city under a federal court order. A retired judge, in senior status, interestingly, a native of Galveston, took over the management of the New York City Department of Correction during that period. And to the question you raised about air conditioning in jails, it goes to responsibility in the construction of facilities and ensuring that inmates are able to live in a hospitable and effective environment, something we found very, very important in building the facilities on Rikers Island. Most facilities exist today. Are they being managed well? I don't think so. Are the feds doing a better job in the Bureau of Prisons? I think largely yes. And why are they doing that? Because they're largely following a campus-type model that you've recommended in this conversation so far. So I think your book and your work has shed a good bit of very interesting light and very helpful light on it. There are success stories. We brought in private industry in New York City to teach inmates who were willing to commit to going to class and learning how to learn, getting trades, and said that and the inmates said, we'll make that commitment. And we said to them, if you make that commitment and carry through, we'll shorten administratively your jail sentences. And that was a terrific incentive. You want to get out? Learn a job, get a trade. And we brought the tradespeople in to teach them how to do it. So that kind of model works. But again, the courts are a key part of the problem because the courts set the standard. If you really want to do sentence modification, correction officials don't do that, judges do that.
Right.
And so courts are a key part of that problem. Anyway, delight to see you here. Thank you for your comments.
Well, thank you for coming and for your remarks.
Okay, y'all be both, you two of you both be very quick, because I'm cognizant of people who may need to get home, and any of you students might have homework and whatnot. Okay.
I wanted to,
yeah,
this
sure.
is a response that straddles a couple of questions about the federal role. One aspect we haven't talked about tonight is Pell Grants. The 1994 Crime Act, which was passed through the Judiciary Committee chaired by a guy named Biden and signed by a president named Clinton, abolished federal Pell Grants for people who were incarcerated. And almost overnight, the number of colleges that offered academic programs in prisons fell off the end of the earth. A lot of them have built back since, but the one intervention, the one kind of programming that has indisputably reduced recidivism is education, especially higher education. Pell Grants have been reauthorized. Congress passed it as a kind of ornament on one of those Christmas tree bills that they passed last year, restored the right of the access to Pell Grants for incarcerated people. The question is whether, you know, it will be implemented.
Okay. Alan, and then I'll let you
Yeah,
finish.
just one question, and I know it's going to vary from state and region, but could you give us an idea of the makeup of prisoner population? I'm curious what percent is white-collar crime, what percent is hardened criminals who are murderers or criminals that repeat people, and how many are drug offenders and misdemeanors?
I don't have those numbers at my my fingertips, I'm afraid to say. And I don't think they're in the book. They're readily available on the Bureau of Justice Statistics website. And as you say, you know, there's a saying in the prison business: if you've seen one prison, you've seen one prison. They are all different, and there are prisons that are minimum security that tend to be relatively low-level drug offenders and some white-collar criminals. But I don't know what the statistical breakdown is by class.
Thank you, though.
Okay. One more. Oh, shit. Okay. Okay. Last two. I'll try to be quick, guys. I'm sorry. If you guys are okay, then Bill, you all right? Okay.
No, I don't mind.
Okay. Okay.
Most of the problems that you talk about needing to be addressed are political problems. Good criminal judges comes up with solutions that politicians cannot allow. And an obvious example is paying prisoners to work. Every prison that's ever worked out of prison work, they pay prisoners trivial amounts to work.
Right.
They produce a recidivism rate, there's problems, they have all kinds, but it gets presented here, and oh my God, last time it was presented, I thought they were going to lynch the people who presented it. It's, we have a political process that goes over form rather than substance. Do you see any way to change that?
The only way to change political problems is by changing the politicians.
Yeah.
I promise this is just a yes or no.
No, it doesn't have to be yes or no. Sorry, I'm not trying to be rude. I'll just try to, be aware of people, might have other things in place they need to get to.
I'll hang around for a while afterwards if anybody
Thank you.
has.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? It's okay if you see a person like me quick to play the race card. But I know that there's a high incidence of African Americans who commit crimes. But when you talk about the homogeneity of countries like Norway and countries like Germany, would it make sense that it's difficult to implement those kinds of reforms in the United States when the largest portion of the population is something or someone other than the people who are the highest in power? Does that make sense? That
Yeah.
you don't have that homogeneity, so those people don't necessarily, you don't relate to them, or you don't, there may not be considered worthy of that type of reform. Do you think that could be
I'll sort of repeat my answer to my own question about what's race got to do with it, everything. I mean, down to the basic levels of prisons that have overwhelmingly black inmates and overwhelmingly white officials, staff. Race is our original sin.
And I'm going to just combine just a great. I just want to give you a chance to close out, and these two questions, I'm going to put them together because I think they're really kind of looking forward in terms of the bigger picture. On a prison level, Mike asks, I worked in prisons for 19 years in healthcare. what can be done to change the mentality, basically, with regards to bringing dignity back to inside other prisons. And Sydney asked, perhaps on a cultural and a nationwide level, what can you say? Can you say that there's a cultural aspect to the U.S.'s attitudes towards criminality? And I suppose just for both of those issues, maybe the hardest things to change, but how do we change our own mindsets and our own cultural view of prisons?
You're giving me another chance to say journalism.
Okay.
I mean, it's like any other problem. First of all, you have to identify it.
Yeah.
And then you have to make sure that people understand it. And then you've got to put people in place who have the power, who are willing to make some changes. It's a kind of banal answer, but it's the reality we live with.
That's excellent. Again, I want to say we have Bill's excellent book, What's Prison For? And it's actually pre-signed if you want to get it afterwards. And I want to say thank you all so much for coming, and particularly want to thank Rocio and everyone at the Houston Holocaust Museum. And will you all please join me in thanking Bill Keller? It was fascinating and excellent. I learned a lot, and I hope you all did as well. Thank you very much, Bill.
You're welcome.